Well, greetings and welcome to the first of your Power and Conflict pre-learning videos. I've done one of these for all of the 15 poems with the notion that you spend 10 minutes on them, you write some notes, and at the start of the next lesson, I test you on some very basic things about the poem. So we're going to look at Ozymandias, which is a crucial poem, certainly when we're exploring the idea of power. So firstly, let me read the poem to you. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So let me just give you some brief pointers about what this poem is actually about. So let me go through those bullet points here. So Ramses II was a pharaoh in classical times and paid for a sculptor to carve a statue of him. Now this was a statue that was dominant, was symbolic of his power, and was really, really important. Of course, now that statue is in disarray, and the first person narrator spoke to a traveller who went to this antique land, and we hear about the fact that this statue that once stood for great power now is dilapidated, is broken, and is in a bit of a mess. But we know from the poem that actually this pharaoh, Ramses II, was a cruel, ruthless, and vain dictator. Really, really important. He ruled by fear. He absolutely did. And as I said, the first person narrator of this poem tells us the statue is destroyed, has spoken to a traveller, and he recounts this traveller's story. And what this poem does, it explores the nature of power and also the dangers of power, and does so in a really interesting way. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go through 4 things about this poem and give you some quotes to think about. The first quote is "Shattered visage lies." Now, visage is another word for kind of face. So very, very clearly, the face of this statue now has been worn away over time. It's shattered, it's fragmented. So let's go on to talk about that. So the first thing to say is shattered is onomatopoeia. And what it does, it brings to life, it amplifies the notion that his identity and his power has been destroyed over time. And shattered brings with it a sense of permanency. That power has been lost forever. It might have been great power, it isn't now. And what Shelley does, the poet, he brings that forward with the use of onomatopoeia there. Really useful. And also the fact that this is a face, it's a really interesting word for face. It shows that his identity and what Ozymandias stood for, ruling through fear, powering people through a really cruel dictatorship, that identity has been lost over time. The power that he had is non-existent anymore. So really important we understand that through the use of onomatopoeia and the fact that this visage now it presents an image in the mind of the reader that what he stood for, his identity, has been lost. So the next quotation I want to look at is "sneer of cold command," and it's describing how the statue looks. Now that word sneer is really, really interesting. It's an intelligent word to use, because what it does, it highlights the cruelty of Ozymandias. It highlights the ruthlessness of Ozymandias, as if he's looking down at his subjects with almost kind of disdain. He doesn't care for them, and he rules through fear and violence. It's really, really interesting. The sneer of cold command, that noun there is really, really crucial. And if we look here at cold command, cold, of course, that word implies that he's unfeeling, that he rules through an aggressive and terrifying manner. But you can see there we've got that phrase cold command, and it's an alliterative phrase. And that repetition of the C sound itself is aggressive. And that represents, it symbolizes, it illustrates how aggressive and terrifying Ozymandias was, and how he exerted his power. And the next phrase is fascinating. He says, "My name is Ozymandias, look on my works." And you can see here how narcissistic this man is, basically how he loves himself. And we know that through the use of that possessive pronoun my, and it's repeated. My name is Ozymandias. He takes a pride in who he is and what he stands for. And that possessive pronoun really tells us that he has pride, he has arrogance, and it shows kind of his vanity that is there. He is what we would describe as the ultimate narcissist. And then he uses that imperative verb look. And of course, that's similar to Lady Macbeth. And that imperative verb, that in itself is a commanding word. It is a command word. And it shows how dominant and overpowering he is. And he's showing off, look on my works. Have a look at what I've achieved. Aren't I great, essentially, is what he is saying. And we can see here, both with those, the use of that possessive pronoun, but also that imperative verb, we can see how this guy is narcissistic, he's vain, he's arrogant, but also he's dominant and overpowering, as shown by the use of that imperative verb. So what's really interesting, if we extend that phrase, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, you will notice the word mighty has a capital M. It's a proper noun, and it's because he is talking to God, and he's almost goading God here. He's bragging to God. He sees himself as a God. He has the ultimate God complex because he is such a narcissist, and that is because it's direct address. He's talking directly, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And the notion that God should despair because of the great work that Ozymandias has done is now ironic, because his works now aren't great. He's the one that should be despairing, because the whole statue itself is a kind of a tribute to the word despair. And that's what Shelley's trying to tell us. This guy, when he lived, he was arrogant, he had excessive pride, hubris, he was a narcissist who loved himself, was vain, and we can see with that juxtaposition with what he said about himself and the current state of his statue, we can see through that power is temporary and that people are sometimes blinded by power. It's genius. It's absolutely brilliant. So let's talk about the structure and form of the poem. Well, essentially, this poem is written in sonnet form. It's a mixture of a Shakespearean sonnet and a Petrarchan sonnet. It has 14 lines. It has a rhyme scheme of sorts, which we'll look at in class. But it's a sonnet, and I wonder why it might be a sonnet. Well, if you think about it, sonnets are written, essentially, they are love poems. So essentially, this is Shelley showing us how much Ozymandias loved himself, the extent of his narcissism, which is really, really clear to see. And that is why it's written in sonnet form. But you'll notice it is an imperfect sonnet. It doesn't quite work. And if we think that sonnets have certain characteristics, they're supposed to have written in iambic pentameter, which is 10 syllables per line, which we'll look at in class, we can see that it doesn't quite work, not in every line. And we can also see that there's lots of caesuras and enjambment, which seems to cause disruption to the poem. And I think what Shelley is trying to tell us here is this is a guy who tried to be all powerful, but we can see you can't hold on to power forever. You are mortal. Your power will someday not exist. And we see that both with the statue, but we also see it with the poem itself. It starts to degenerate. It doesn't quite work. And however powerful Ozymandias thought he was, the structure and form of the poem shows us that actually that will be taken away over time. And we can suggest that the structural weakness of the poem is similar to the statue's structural weakness. So what do we know about the context of the time? Well, in Shelley's time, he was making a political point. In Shelley's time, he disagreed with the government policies, particularly the growth of the empire. The British Empire was expanding, and perhaps this poem was a warning to the British Empire. You might think you're all conquering, you might think that power lasts forever, but it won't. And Shelley's been proved correct. Of course, the last kind of bit of the British Empire, I suppose, was handed back in 1997. That was Hong Kong. So perhaps this is a poem about the British Empire's hubris and excessive pride. But also the poem has a timeless quality, and we can think about all the civilizations, the powerful civilizations that do crumble with time. Think about the Roman Empire, lots of classical empires as well. But perhaps Shelley's making another point here as well, that the words of the statue have survived, and perhaps it's saying, Shelley's saying or implying that the words of poets will outlive the words of dictators. So look, there's your pre-learning for the lesson. I'll be testing you on this, so let's see how much you pick up, and then we're going to go into more detail at the start of our lesson. Good luck.